What happens when a Hollywood star, who has carefully avoided scandal throughout her life, sits across from a host who has made scandal an art? That night, the red chair of the Graham Norton Show wasn't hosting any ordinary guest. When Margot Robbie, with her glittering career, elegant manners, and the darling of millions, stepped into the studio, no one could have predicted what happened within minutes. At first, it was just a friendly conversation. But within minutes, the tension on the screen escalated so much that the audience was glued to the screen. This wasn't just an actress interview. This was the middle of a confrontation with the media. The studio was awash with extraordinary energy that night. The famous red chair glowed under the lights, almost like a theater stage. The audience waited, whispering, as Graham sipped from his water bottle, glanced at his cards, and wore his usual mischievous smile. Everything was set for another night of fun. And the moment arrived. Margot Robbie stepped into the studio in classic Hollywood glamour. Her elegant, cream-colored, off-the-shoulder dress, natural makeup, and confident yet humble presence captivated everyone. The applause practically rocked the hall. Margot smiled, bowed to the audience, and gently shook Graham's hand before moving to the far end of the red couch. "Hollywood's golden girl, Margot Robbie," Graham said, glancing at her cards as the applause subsided. "Welcome to our studio, Margot. How's life been treating you these days?" Margot smiled politely. "It's been busy, but wonderful. New films, production projects, a little breathless, but still exciting." The audience applauded again. Margot bowed her head slightly. Everything, at least for now, was as it should be. "I'm fine, Graham, really," Margot said, her smile elegant but measured. "I'm busy, new productions, a mentoring program for young women, and—" She paused for a moment, her gaze flickering to the audience. "I've been trying to live a little more on my own lately." The audience erupted in applause. Graham nodded slightly, his gaze sparking with intelligence. "Ah, privacy," he said, half serious, half mocking. "We'll definitely get to that later, because that must be a bit difficult when the whole world knows your name by heart, right?" Margot kept her smile, but a shadow crept into her eyes. "But first," Graham said, holding up her cards slightly, "let's get to the projects we have coming up. I believe you have a documentary coming out soon?" Margot nodded. "Yes, it's a production about the female extras in the film industry and the unseen workers behind the scenes. I think their stories are worth telling. Those invisible hands that are always overlooked, yet make the magic that is film possible." The audience nodded in appreciation. For a few minutes, the studio settled into a peaceful flow. Graham cracked a few jokes. Margot laughed heartily, and the atmosphere lightened. The laughter echoed off the studio walls. But then, Graham's tone shifted almost imperceptibly. The friendly expression on his face gave way to a wry, attentive gaze. "So," he said with a fake naturalness, "your casting choices have changed dramatically over the last few years. Sometimes you're like a classic movie queen, and sometimes you're taking on projects like a YouTube star. Should we view this as artistic evolution or some kind of market strategy?" Margot's jaw tightened slightly, but she continued to smile. "I just want to try different things. Creativity isn't about fitting into boxes." Graham chuckled softly, a wry warmth in his voice. "Ooh, but please." Sure, but sometimes from the outside it seems a bit something. Prestigious festival awards one day, viral interviews the next. Is this a premeditated change of direction?" A tentative laugh rose from the audience. One of those nervous laughs, unsure of what to do. Margot's expression hardened a little. "Not changing direction, forging my own path," she said succinctly. Graham cocked his head to the side, tapping his cards. Forging my own path. That's the word that's been coming up most often in comments about you lately. Independence. But strangely, in seeking independence, you always seem to become more visible. More headlines, more programs, more cameras. Isn't that a paradox?" Margot's eyes weren't smiling anymore. "Being visible isn't the same as being exploited, Graham," she said, her voice soft but spiky. "I'm telling my own story, to prevent others from distorting it." Graham narrowed his eyes, his voice calm but deliberately inflammatory. So, are we the problem? Margot didn't answer, but there was an electricity in the air now, a quiet tension, and that was just the beginning. Toxic press, toxic traditions, toxic roles, Graham muttered, tapping his cards lightly on the table. But I wonder, Margot, in all these years, has there been anything you've ever loved about Hollywood? Margot blinked, then leaned back slightly. She crossed her arms. Her tone was colder now. That's not a fair question, Graham, she said slowly. I've dedicated years to this industry. I've worked with directors I admired. I've mentored young actresses, but at some point, that industry started to harm those I loved. Even myself. Graham shook his head slightly, but kept his smile. The harm, was it from the press or from the industry itself? He asked, his voice filled with an almost childish curiosity. Margot's voice had dropped an octave. Both. The atmosphere in the studio had changed markedly. The audience was no longer moving. Graham sensed this, but he didn't stop. On the contrary, he turned the next card. So let me ask you about that producer you worked with on your last film, he said, his voice still soft, but his words sharp. Some critics think working with him was a strategic choice, specifically to reposition your career. Was this collaboration planned? Margot's lips tightened. That's patently ridiculous, he said, his voice thick, and a rather insulting insinuation. Graham smiled and raised his hands. I don't mean to offend you. I'm just stating the rumors that are floating around. These are things people are talking about. Margot leaned forward. Her eyes were fixed directly on Graham. Perhaps people shouldn't talk about things they know nothing about. There was an uneasy stirring in the audience. Graham felt it too, but he didn't back down. I understand, of course, he said calmly. But let's be honest. In the last few years, you've changed managers, left your agency, considered moving back to Australia, and completely deleted social media. But we still see you on every cover, on every screen. If you want to live so privately, why don't you just withdraw from the spotlight altogether? That's when Margot's smile flickered, but there was no warmth in it. You really don't understand, do you? She said, her voice thin but with a tone that seemed to be trying to suppress the anger seething within her. Graham tilted his head, his voice still reminiscent of the old, sympathetic British presenter. I think I do, but I'd like to hear your explanation. Margot's eyes lit up. This isn't about disappearing, she said, her words emphatically. This is about telling my story myself before others distort it. It's about owning my own truth. Graham clenched his fingers on the table. So we're the problem, are we? Margot didn't answer, but her face was no longer in dialogue. It was in struggle. Graham leaned back slowly in his chair, clasping his fingers together in a triangle. So it's about us, he said, as if talking to himself. Margot didn't answer. But these were moments when the silence was as powerful as the answer. Almost everyone in the studio held their breath. The cameras were still rolling, the lights had grown brighter, the air felt heavier. Margot sat bolt upright in the famous red chair. Her jaw was clenched, her fingers dug into the armrest. As for Graham, he still looked relaxed, with the confidence of a man who had dealt with dozens of difficult guests. But he knew too, he was sitting on a powder keg right now, and he was striking the match with his own hands. Okay, Graham said after a moment of silence, his voice soft but with a hint of defiance. It's obvious you want to control the narrative, Margot. But let's be honest. You want privacy, yet here you are. You're promoting your book, your documentary, your podcast in front of millions of viewers. Isn't that a bit contradictory? Margot's lip curled slightly, but it wasn't a smile. It was a cold, introspective defense. There's a big difference between denigrating someone and telling your own story. Graham leaned forward, his voice almost whisper-soft but sharp as a knife. Yes, but doesn't telling your story also mean being open to interpretation? The more you share, the more it's analyzed. You can't expect people to just accept your point of view, can you? Margot's eyes narrowed. So they should just accept your point of view? Graham chuckled quietly. I don't have a point of view, Margot. I just have questions. And at that moment, a glow spread across Margot's cheeks. Anger, shame, or suppressed disappointment. No one was sure, But the audience could sense a shift in atmosphere. They were witnessing something, and it wasn't entirely media play, nor was it simply an actor's promotional interview. This was a personal reckoning. Questions, Margot said, her voice deeper and more determined this time. I've been getting these questions for years, but none of them actually care about the answer. They're all asked for the same purpose, to generate headlines. You love headlines, not humanity. A murmur rose from the audience. Graham interlaced his fingers again. Okay, he said, a fake smile now etched on his face. Let me approach it from a different perspective. A few years ago, you said in an interview that women felt isolated in the industry. You mentioned that they didn't receive enough support, especially on certain projects. Could you elaborate on that? At what points did you feel isolated? Margot's face hardened. Her eyelids closed for a moment. She took a deep breath. The storm wasn't far off now. Can you tell us exactly what kind of support you were looking for? Graham asked, his voice still laced with artificial politeness. What did you ask for help with, and were you turned down? Margot exhaled sharply through her nose. I just wanted the protection a male actor would receive, she said. I wanted to be applauded, to be told without question or disdain as a man's achievement. But I wasn't given that opportunity. His voice had become thicker and colder. Not, he repeated, this time with emphasis. Let's change the subject. Graham raised a slight eyebrow but didn't stop. He flipped his cards over and picked up the next card. Okay, you've previously addressed the sexism and discrimination female actors face in some interviews. However, many people consider your criticisms exaggerated. Some even claim that you silence every criticism by using such rhetoric. Do you think that's a fair criticism? Margot's head jerked back, as if she'd been slapped by an invisible force. Excuse me? She said, her voice icy. Just one question, Graham said, his expression unchanged. Some circles think that attributing every negative comment in the industry to discrimination also stifles genuinely constructive criticism. Don't you think that's risky? Margot leaned forward, her voice rising now. No, Graham, the risky thing is legitimizing the condescending remarks that have been systematically directed at women for years under the guise of opinion. Every time someone defends themselves, they label them oversensitive. A slight murmur rose from the audience. Graham watched her fixedly, one eyebrow raised. Of course, he said calmly. But wouldn't it be dangerous to assume every negative comment is also linked to discrimination? Sometimes people just don't like certain choices you make. That's not necessarily prejudice, is it? Margot narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. You're on a very thin line, Graham, she said. Very, very thin. Graham's smile was now colder. I walk the same line with every guest, Margot. I bring the questions they want to ask the public. If those questions bother you, maybe it's not the questions themselves, but the answers. At that moment, the atmosphere in the studio was dead. The other guests had practically dimmed in their seats. The lights were still the same, but everyone in the studio now had tense body language. The game being played was pushing the boundaries. After a long pause, Graham spoke again. Okay, let's change the subject. In past interviews, you've described Hollywood as a mechanism. Can you elaborate on that? Was it more about systems than people? Margot's gaze was now glazed over. Her jaw muscle twitched slightly. She had simply wanted to tell her story. But now, that narrative was crumbling before her. Some people say that description of you is rather distant, Graham said, softening his tone but not hiding his intentions. After all, you're talking about the industry that made you a star. Do you think there's still love between you, or is it just duty and habit? Margot's nostrils flared. Her fingers dug into the edge of her chair. I love this industry, she said in a slow, trembling voice. But love isn't enough, Graham. Loyalty means nothing if it's one-sided. Interesting, Graham murmured, his eyes still fixated on Margot's. And could they be thinking the same thing? Do you think you've been unfaithful to them? Margot turned to him suddenly, her voice sharpening. You don't know them. You don't know me either. So don't pretend you understand. Graham's voice was still silky smooth. I'm just asking what millions of viewers think. Margot shook her head. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. You don't ask questions. You accuse. You do it all the time. You disguise justice as entertainment. For the first time, Graham's smile wavered. Entertainment and journalism are not mutually exclusive, he said, his tone soft but sharp inside. Margot's voice rose. The fragility in her vocal cords was now palpable. You call this journalism? Luring people into this chair and exposing their brokenness, their trauma, as if we were exhibits at a zoo. Is this your journalism? Margot! Graham began to say, but Margot cut him off harshly. No, don't call me Margot in that easy tone. From where you sit, with your bards and that condescending grin, you manipulate people. You make them laugh, but at the same time you're tearing them apart inside, and you're too arrogant to see it. The words hung in the air. The audience seemed to have forgotten even to breathe. Graham's expression hardened for the first time. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes bore into Margot's. And you, he said in a low, sharp tone, you think you're immune from criticism just because you've suffered. But you're not. You came here of your own volition. You knew these questions would come, and now you're personally making everyone question why they treat you as if you were untouchable. Margot froze for a moment. Her eyes were blazing, her breathing quickened. The trembling in her hands could no longer be concealed. And then, for a moment, she actually looked like she was going to get up and leave. She straightened her knees, her eyes darkening. But not yet. She hadn't exploded yet. But no, he hasn't gotten up yet. He hasn't left yet. For a few seconds, the studio froze completely. The audience sat with their eyes wide open, their mouths closed, not daring to breathe. The air was heavy, an uncomfortable electric weight. The cameras captured every detail. Margot's clenched jaw, the tensed muscles of her neck, the familiar defiance flickering slightly in Graham's eyes, and the shy, sheltering expressions on the faces of the other guests on the couch. They seemed to want to sink into the chair. Margot's breaths were now distinct enough to be picked up on the microphone. Short, rapid, as if she were trying to release a burden pressed against her chest. Her shoulders were rigid, her fingers clenched so tightly that her knuckles were white. And Graham leaned back in his chair, fingers carefully arranged with a measured grace, like a Zen master in the center of a storm. Graham was the first to break the silence. His voice was soft, but the edge within was as sharp as a scalpel. You sound angry. Margot's head snapped up. Her eyes flashed like fire. Angry? She said, her voice low but filled with a vibrancy. You sit here taking subtle jabs at me, my family, my career, and you ask if I'm angry. Do you really think I don't understand what you're doing? Graham's expression remained unchanged. Tell me what I'm doing, he said, almost curiously. Margot's lips pressed shut, her eyes narrowed. You're turning me into a spectacle. That's exactly what this show does. You invite people in, you laugh in their faces, but really you're slowly dissecting them, like it's just a bit of fun, a bit of harmless banter. Graham tilted his head slightly to the side. His voice was still measured. And you came here knowing all this, didn't you? Then why did you come? The question hit Margot like a physical slap. She blinked for a moment, her lips trembling, but she quickly recovered. Anger inevitably rose again. Because I thought maybe you were different, she said, her voice beginning to crack. Maybe I thought I'd be treated like a human being here. Not a headline, not a hashtag, not the next viral moment. Graham's smile was now dim, but his eyes flickered with a cold gleam. I welcomed you here like any other guest. Nothing more, nothing less, he said. The rules are no different for you, Margot. You just act like you expect them to not apply to you. Margot's eyes darkened, her throat constricted, but she swallowed. The audience remained silent. But at that moment, everyone could feel that a big explosion was just one sentence away. Margot's fists clenched on her knees, her nails dug into her palms. Oh, stop that virtuous fairy tale, she said through her teeth, her voice now thorny. You think you're superior to the tabloids because you do it with a smile. But you're worse than them. At least they don't hide what they are. A muffled murmur rose from the audience. Some turned their heads, others held their breath. Graham's eyebrows furrowed. The elegant softness in his voice had now become a tight line. Are you saying they're worse than me? You mean you hold me more responsible than those magazines that tore you apart? Does that mean you agree with those who tried to tear you apart in the past? Margot paused for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. But then she jumped to her feet, her face burned with anger. Don't mention my mother, she snapped. Her voice echoed through the studio. Don't bring her into this. Don't you dare. Graham leaned back for the first time. The other guests were frozen in their seats. Some bowed their heads, some averted their eyes. The audience, however, looked less like they were watching a play than an accident, unable to look away, but also unable to look away. Margot, Graham said, his voice still flat, but this time with a thorn in his side. Haven't you used your mother's memory for years? In some of your interviews, in some of your documentaries. But when someone else mentions her name, does it suddenly become taboo? Isn't that hypocrisy? Margot's chest heaved, her chin quivered. You don't know anything, she said, her voice almost hoarse. Graham tilted his head. If I don't know, tell it. Tell the audience. You keep saying you want to hear your truth. Now is the time. But if you keep standing here accusing everyone of malice, we'll never hear the real truth. Margot shook her head slowly. A bitter smile crossed her lips. You go about this job thinking you're asking tough questions, Bob, he said. But all you're really doing is making people squirm in front of the camera. You're not interested in the answer. You're just counting people's tears as ratings. Graham's lips thinned, but his eyes remained fixed. A harsh comment, he said slowly, but an interesting theory. So why does someone who's suffered so much, who wants to tell her own story, seem to avoid her own questions the most? And then, the studio went dead. Margot's eyes were blazing, and she stood still. But now her next sentence was either the final blowout or a silent collapse. Graham's lips pressed into a thin line. He swallowed, but didn't look away. Interesting theory, he said quietly. But the only person forcing you to squirm in that chair right now is you. And there it was. Margot's entire posture crumbled, but not from weakness, from the anger no longer finding any outlet. Her voice rose, almost shouting. You really think this is a show, don't you? A fun evening, a little laughter, a little tension. But to you people, my life are just figures to distract the audience. She took a step toward the front of the announcer's desk. Her face was twisted with anger. Congratulations, Graham, you did it. You created the moment you've been waiting for. But listen to this. She put her finger on the table, her voice no longer trembling. It came out with a shaky determination. This isn't a game. This isn't some media theater just to generate a few headlines and tweets. This is my life. I'm a real person. I have real pain, real limitations, real shame. And you sacrificed all of that for viewership. The studio was silent. It was as if the entire audience had merged into a single entity, deciding not to breathe. Graham's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a coldness in his voice. If you really feel that way, Margot, then you shouldn't have come here in the first place. No one forced you into this chair. You chose to speak. Now, when the questions don't suit you, you accuse me of bullying. Margot leaned forward slowly. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the microphone picked up every word clearly. You have no right to sit there. You have no right to carry that microphone because you don't welcome people. You trap them. You invite them here. Then you humiliate them, tear them apart, and rise above them. And that doesn't make you great, Graham. You're just another parasite. The words froze in the studio, heavy, poisonous, and irrevocable. Graham didn't move, but his jaw was set. He stood silently. He leveled himself with Margot. Two people, no longer actors or presenters. Both were simply human, but one was fighting, the other had already drawn his sword, and their eyes met. Nothing was said, yet. Perhaps, Graham finally said, his voice low but firm, you should ask yourself why you feel so small. And then, that sentence, the spark hit the gunpowder. Margot slammed her microphone against the table with such force that the audience jumped in their seats. The sound echoed through the studio, wiping out the smiles. Her voice was explosive, raw, unfiltered. "Enough," she shouted. "That's it. It's over. You take me, my family, my pain, the most vulnerable moments of my life, and package them as entertainment. You think you're clever, don't you? You think you grow by humiliating people. But you're not. You're pathetic, Graham. This show is pathetic." Then she turned and looked at the audience. She extended one arm widely, gesturing toward the hall. "And you applauded too. You laughed too. You watched a person get torn apart and did nothing. Are you feeling good? Seriously, are you going to go home tonight and say, 'What a great show'?" The room was silent. No one moved. Some looked down, some averted their eyes. Margot turned back to Graham. Her voice was now trembling with anger, but her words were clear. "You, Payo, are the living embodiment of why this world has become so desensitized. You disguise cruelty as humor. You measure pain with ratings, and you call it a profession. But here, Graham, I'm not playing your game anymore." She took a step forward, then another. The cameras followed her. The thud of her heels clacked against the studio floor, shattering the silence of the room. She stood erect, her fists were still clenched. Graham remained standing behind his desk. His face was expressionless. His hands were flat on the table. His eyes were fixed on the door through which Margot had exited. The noise when the door closed was like a curtain falling. The audience froze. No applause, no reaction. Just the fading of Margot's footsteps. And then silence. The guests seated on the couch exchanged glances, their eyes scanning the surroundings with hesitant glances, as if to say, "Should we get up and leave?" The cameras were still focused on Graham. He stood there, leaning against the table, wordless. Finally, he slowly adjusted his jacket. He let out a deep breath. Then he turned his head to the audience. That familiar grin appeared on his face, but this time it was steely cold. "Well," Graham said with a dry smile, "that was quite colorful." A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the room. Some applauded politely. Graham raised his hand, silencing them all. This time his voice was serious. "Look," he began, "tonight took a turn I think none of us expected. Even me." He paused for a moment, surveying the room. Then he looked directly at the camera. "I've been doing this a long time," he said, his voice steady but deliberately slow. "Who haven't I hosted in this chair? Rock stars, prime ministers, Nobel Prize-winning authors, Oscar-winning actors, saints, and sinners. Some were lovely, some were difficult, but they were all human." He tapped the table with his fingers. "And that's what we're doing here. Asking questions. Sometimes easy, sometimes uncomfortable, but questions that must be answered. This isn't bullying. This isn't cruelty. This is talking. And if a guest isn't ready for that, they shouldn't have accepted that seat in the first place." Scattered applause erupted from the hall. Graham smiled slightly, but stopped applauding. As for Margot Robbie, his voice softened, but the controlled coolness within him was still palpable. "I deeply empathize with what she's going through. She faced global attention at a young age. She was pressured. She was besieged by expectations." But then, his tone sharpened again. "But empathy never means being immune to criticism, especially when you step into the spotlight to tell your own story. Tonight, I'm telling you clearly, I didn't tear her apart. She tore herself apart. She was so desperate for control that she couldn't bear the questions I asked. And that says more about her than it does about me." Murmurs rose from the audience. Some applauded again, this time more confidently. Graham's gaze dropped to the floor, then back to the camera, and one final message. "And Margot, if you're watching this, I wish you and the people in your life nothing but peace, but if you're here to tell your truth, don't expect anyone to just nod and smile, because that wouldn't be honest. That would be theater, and this show isn't theater, it's a confrontation." He shrugged slightly. Then he sat back in his seat. He picked up one of his cue cards. "Well," he said, his sarcastic wit returning, It was Margot Robbie for about 15 minutes. The audience laughed more freely this time. The tension began to ease. Now, das ist ja, he said, turning to the guest sitting on the couch who had relaxed a little. At least we have another guest who hasn't left the stage yet. The camera pulled back slightly. Graham shuffled his cards as if nothing had happened. But that slight grin on his face said it all. Then he turned directly to the camera once more. His eyes narrowed. His familiar killjoy humor was on display one last time. And if you were watching at home and were disturbed, don't be, he said, because the truth is often disturbing. And tonight you all saw it with your own eyes. He leaned back. He spread his arms freely. The studio lights fell on him. The applause erupted again. And so Margot Robbie's unforgettable exit from the Graham Norton Show became a modern tragedy about the limits of media, human dignity, and public vulnerability.